as I promised. Next, Patrick Spencer, Conservative for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich, a member of the Education Committee. Patrick, welcome to Talk Drive. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Jeremy.
I didn't get an answer from Matt Vickers, so I'm determined to get one from you. This grooming gang, no, let's be honest, this rape gang debate that has become that, a rape gang debate, rather than people accepting that this is so abhorrent and patently hasn't been dealt with for years. I'm not blaming you, but I'm going to ask you the question. How the hell in 14 years, actually 18 months after the inquiry had given those 20 recommendations, did Rishi Sunak's government do absolutely nothing to implement those 20 things? Because the fact of the matter is we're sat here, and I'm not sticking up for Starmer. I'd be the last person. I think he's a disgrace, right? Not to have an inquiry and to tell his MPs how to vote. But it would be fair to say, my friend, your party could have done a lot more whilst in government, couldn't they?
Well, look, this is the million-dollar question, right? And I just heard your caller from Gosport, and you challenged me before I joined. Why hasn't this been dealt with? As I see it, there are three fundamental problems, of which, I think, as a society and a culture, we are nervous to approach. But we haven't got on top of our ability to deport nationals who have committed crime. So we have been soft on the perpetrators. I think immigration policy has made this problem worse over time. And like I said before, I think culturally, and it's not a problem just with Whitehall, but across our society and across our public institutions, clearly the culture and fear of being tarnished as a racist continues to pervade.
So let's stop at that point. So would you be honest enough? Would you be honest enough and say that Tories, when in government, are, and I wrote down what you said, nervous to approach that situation, concerned that culturally, I mean, I said it last week on the show, my friend, I said that if 10 years ago or even 5 years ago you talked about immigration and the problems with illegal migrants coming to this country, you would have been labelled a racist. Thank the God, the Lord, we're having that conversation now. Do you think times have changed and people will not accept this whitewash? Because my fear, and I'm genuinely not into conspiracy theories, but you can sit here every day like me and you'd end up thinking this goes much higher and much deeper than even the worst of us would think. Genuinely, I feel that.
Look, we've come a long way from the age of New Labour, where it was considered unacceptable to talk about the risk of extreme levels of migration into this country, and perhaps that's the nature of populations and culture and society, is that we move slower than events. Let me just approach though the criticism that the Tories didn't do enough. Perhaps we didn't do enough while in government, but I believe we did some things. You know, the J Review introduced 20 recommendations, of which we undertook 18 of them. The big one that we didn't undertake was mandatory reporting, on which we consulted on, and 51% of the sector didn't want mandatory reporting. And as a husband of a teacher, I can see some real risks in mandatory reporting, bringing criminal cases against people who have made a mistake but are not guilty of criminal negligence. We introduced a gang task force that literally protected thousands of people and uncovered hundreds of different gangs. Richard Holder, the MP for Badderton-Billericay, introduced new rules and laws on licensing of taxis that we know were absolutely critical in the proliferation of this problem. Could we have gone further? Of course, we always could. But I'll tell you what, it's the Conservative Party, first and foremost, willing to have these complicated conversations. And it's the other party, Labour, who are standing in the way of a national inquiry because they don't want to have these awkward conversations.
So why, but then, all right, okay, I'm not, listen, half of the problem, and I accept your answer, Patrick, but half the problem is that we are then going to get to a point where it's us and them. Are you a father?
Yes.
You are?
2 boys, yes.
Okay, so if you had a girl, I've got 4 girls. I have no shame in telling you, and you're an elected member of Parliament, I would go to prison if somebody did that to my daughter. And I think the politicians of all sides need to understand seriously and very quickly that this is not about what Jess Phillips tweeted in 2015 or what the Tories did or didn't do or what this campaign talked about or what we implemented or what Starmer's doing now or why The fact of the matter is, looking at this country as a place where the Church of England has just been outed as covering up child abuse, right? Where the news at 10, the most famous newsreader on the BBC for years who announced the Queen's death, he and his pedo mates can get suspended sentences and still be in society. And now we've got grooming gangs, actually not going to call them grooming gangs, rape gangs taking the innocence of kids. I think we'd be looking at that society and I think we'd be saying, Patrick, that's pretty bloody barbaric. And I think whatever your political persuasion, we need to get to, I don't care. Somebody's just said to me the King needs to step in and do a royal commission into this because this is not going to go away. That's all I'm saying. I'm not getting on a hobby horse. As a father, I find it so utterly repugnant that I don't give a toss about what your politics is. Morally, this is so disgusting. This country needs to put it right as soon as possible.
I couldn't disagree with any of that. What we need is leadership. We need people brave enough to stick their head above the parapet, bluntly people in elected positions, to say enough is enough. There is a relationship between ethnicity and a subcultural practice of grooming. There is a relationship between immigration and the problem we face. There is a problem with an uber-liberal code of silence and fear of asking difficult questions that has allowed this problem to proliferate. This is why we need a national inquiry. This is why we need a national review. We will get to the bottom of it as a country. I believe Britain is a good and decent place made up of good and decent people who are shocked and appalled by what they've read, what they've heard, and what they're listening to. But it will take time. But I would say this government's failure to bring about a national inquiry is a national disgrace. They don't want to do it. And I'll say this again because I think it's really important. Politicians can do the right thing and stand tall. But in this situation, they're not doing it because it forces them into a complicated conversation around ethnicity, cultural practices, that they rely on large numbers of voters in parts of the country where we're going to have to ask these questions. And someone like Jess Phillips, who said some outrageous things during the riots over the last summer, is absolutely culpable for doing this.
And our Ange has gone very quiet. We must say Angela Rayner, nobody's heard a bleat and squeak from her. Very quickly, because I know you're a busy man. Schools bill is an act of vandalism for the education services, say the Tories. Were you saying to me, Ryan? Oh, I thought Ryan was saying something to me. Sorry, go on.
Yes, the bill that was brought forward by the Labour government today for its second reading, which I've been in the chamber for, is nothing short of an absolute disgrace. The improvement in education in this country over the last 14 years has been a quiet miracle. We have risen through the rankings in maths, in English, in reading, in writing. Children are actually leaving education more able than they have been able to in a generation. The beneficiaries are predominantly disadvantaged children in inner city areas. The irony of this all is that the reforms that were largely introduced, which were largely carried out by the Conservative Michael Gove, were introduced by David Blunkett and Tony Blair. But this government hasn't done the work on education. It hasn't done any of the work looking at the evidence of what's in the best interest of children. They've lent and relied on their union paymasters to come up with ideas, and they've introduced a retrograde, backward-looking, dumbing down of our education system as a result. It's a tragedy. A tragedy for children.
What do you make? What do you make then as an overview? This is really interesting because we've never spoken before, right? So, what do you make of an overview of the last 6 months? We've had a man who, won the biggest majority for years on a lower vote than Jeremy Corbyn, who obviously has quite personally decided to attack anything that pensioners are. I mean, he's going to, if you don't freeze them to death, you're now going to cancel the free prescriptions, so they won't be able to keep the medicine or even get the medicine that they need to stay alive. You talk about the way he's treated, I mean, so many, and he gave his union mates 30% pay rises, and veterans are screwed, and pensioners are screwed, and so many people seem to be suffering at the hands of this man. What do you make of his first 6 months? Because every day we come in here, you leave this studio with the belief that Keir Starmer is massively out of his depth. And as I said in the run-up to the election, his tent is so large, he invited everybody, didn't he, that he now spends his entire time being attacked from so many different angles and trying to please all the people all the time, and ends up hacking off most of the country all of the time, if I'm honest.
I understand why the Tories lost the last election.
Good.
I understand people's frustration with the Tory party, with our failure to deliver on some pretty key issues, and because there was a loss and a decline in standards of public probity in office. However, to have watched the British public reaction to a new Labour government ride roughshod over some pretty critical things has been nothing short of astounding. And I would leave this conversation with one thing. It really matters who we elect into government. Like I said, I understand why people have had enough of the Tories, and it's for us as a party, me as an MP, as a representative, to get on top of that and to re-engage with our population and our constituents. But it really matters. And for the many people who voted reform, who allowed Labour to get in, I hope we take it more seriously next time, because Labour, they have crashed the economy.
I have to jump in there and tell you, because I should do. I'm 60 years of age. I was a Tory voter until the last election when I voted for reform. And many people like me are really offended when you say that voting for reform let Labour in. Because this box of sweets could have stood against your government and got elected, because the British people, let's be honest, Patrick, had stopped listening to the Tory party. And when I hear people in the Tory party and Labour say that reform is far right, I would respectfully suggest that is your problem, because I was brought up in a Conservative house that believed in stringent, low taxation, balancing the books, strong military, not a fear of crime, but actually a fear of the police, strong borders, etc., etc. A lot of what reform was talking about, and with the greatest respect to the Tories, you weren't talking about that at the last election as loudly as you should have been, and that's why I think so many people went to reform. But you make as big a mistake, the Tory party, by calling that far right, as Starmer does, that anybody disagrees with him. Reform have actually, I think, captured the hearts and the souls of millions of people who are massively dissatisfied with the Tory party, and I think that's really, really relevant for you to take on board.
I take that on board, and I accept your point. And like I said, I understand why people were angry with the Conservative Party at the last general election, but I want to talk about the future and about how we get Labour out of government. And we have to be serious that splitting the right is not a good idea. The Conservative Party will go into the next election standing on a platform that will deliver growth, lower taxes, lower regulation, support for the most vulnerable in society, reforming our public services as we did in education. That means
do you think you can get the reform voters back, or do you think there will need to be some sort of joining of the two?
I believe we can. I know a lot of people who voted reform. I know a lot of people in my patch who voted reform, and they gave us a kicking, and we deserved it. And we've heard that, and we've got to learn from it. And we will, and we'll go back, and I promise you, we will be a better party and a better country for it.
No, good man. Listen, it's great to have you on, first time ever. I hope you come back as well. Patrick Spencer MP, Tory MP for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich.